have from conferences.
It's so dry.
Although I come home lately and I find like
It is, yeah.
way
It's very
back,
dry.
and there's a lot of that stuff in there. I get, you know what they give you the tumblers, you know, like for the coffee in the car thing. Those are all cool.
Yeah, so belt buckle is a little bit imaginative. Still not quite up there with the bread trim and comb.
Take advantage of
I have one.
You have
our last
William, when he
opportunity to.
interned,
Yeah,
He gave me a Brad Sherman cone. Yeah.
There I go. KP.
Hello, Stuart.
Is that a sponsor?
I like how come I'm not on that list? And you didn't take me to.
So does your firm ever have need of student interns?
Yes, all the time. I can give you a card.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, exactly.
Plenty of research we could use help with, and it's a good thing. So we're a lobbying firm and a PR firm. So we advocate the capital, the administration, and then.
Right.
We start in like 2 minutes. We'll still be filming,
Okay.
and that's fine. I
Okay.
think there's going to be a long conversation, so we want
Yeah.
to start at 11 or 2, and then we can hopefully get through it.
Are the mics on?
The mics are on, and then there's in your script it says what time to start wrapping. So 12 to 10, we're going to start wrapping. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. It's about 2 minutes time. I'll go and retrieve Sherry.
Someone actually said. I said, well. Sounds like a sitcom. I said, reality.
So what classes do you teach?
Oh, so I teach courses on the presidency and presidential elections and public policy. And I teach a lot of just intro to American politics.
A lot of history. And
Yeah, I mean, we sort of combine history and more current stuff, but definitely a lot of history. Some Federalist Papers.
right.
One of us got it. Or both of us got it. Yeah.
Lots of good stuff. We just spent a day looking at the structure of the executive branch.
That's true. No, trust me.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound very exciting, but it's like that's how stuff gets done. And it's,
the rules that govern it.
rules govern it.
Yeah.
What?
The rules are important.
Well,
At least we thought they were.
yeah, right. Well, just the, I was just telling Pat that yesterday I was teaching a course in my class in my intro course on the structure of the executive branch.
Oh, boy.
And, the different, types of departments and agencies and independent regulatory commissions.
Very quickly, Lisa Danzig. I am a USC alum myself, and Dan was one of my favorite professors, actually. So very excited to hear from this man
Thank you.
today.
That'll be great. Where are you now?
I work at Elevate Public Affairs. So we do PR for businesses, coalitions, organizations, some nonpartisan political stuff, different legislation.
At least you're getting.
So are you from California originally?
Yeah, I grew up
So I'm very excited. It's nice to always see more women in issues.
Well,
They certainly do.
I know. It never changes.
And it's easy to point to the flaws of not having.
Okay.
Exactly. Thank you. What was that?
Thank you, Stuart. We're gonna go ahead and get started, and people will continue to kind of fill in the room, but we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, my name is Pat Joyce. I'll be your moderator today. I'm here on behalf of KP Public Affairs, the panel sponsor. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize our track sponsor, LA Police Protective League. So thank you very much for your support. Quick housekeeping item. There at your seat, there's an exit survey for this panel. Please take a couple minutes to fill that out. And on your way out of the room, you can drop that off with VICA staff in the back. Appreciate that. All the panelists' biographies are in the journal. I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone. To my right, we have Andrew Busch, Crown Professor of Government and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. Then we have Sherry Bebitch Jeffe, political analyst, KNBC, and retired professor from USC. Next to her is Matt Klink, president of Klink Campaigns, and finally, Dan Schnur, professor at UC Berkeley. So we're in a very exciting time in politics. The California primary has moved up to March. There's lots of different topics we're going to cover today, so I don't want to waste any more time. I'm going to ask each panelist to take a couple minutes to go ahead and make some general comments, frame up the discussion for today and what we plan to talk about. So let's start with Andy. Thank you.
Sure. So I volunteered to throw in a few comments about the Senate next year. The presidential election is going to be the big hot topic, of course, but I think probably the second biggest question is going to be who has the majority in the Senate. Having a majority doesn't always mean that much in the Senate because you can filibuster and stop things with 40 votes right now, or 41 at least. But on other matters, judicial appointments and budget matters, 51 is enough to decide things, so it is important. In 2018, the Democrats were facing a really tilted, difficult situation in the Senate because, as you know, only 1/3 of the senators are up at any one time, and so the outcome depends a lot on which third that is. And in 2018, there were 22 Democratic seats that the Democrats had to defend, and only 12 Republican seats, and about probably at least half a dozen of those Democratic seats were in states that Donald Trump had won. And so they faced a really difficult map, you could say. In 2020, the ratio was flipped. Actually, there are 23 seats that Republicans have to defend, and only 12 seats that Democrats have to defend. However, unlike 2018, there were very few seats in places that you might consider opposition territory. So there's actually one Democrat who is going to be facing, I think, a really difficult time in trying to retain his seat in Alabama. He kind of won in a little bit of a flukish special election.
Thank you, Roy Moore.
Yeah. He can't count on running against.
Myself.
Yes. The Republicans have a couple of seats in places that Hillary Clinton won. One of them is in Colorado, one of them is in Maine. But Maine is kind of an unusual case too because Donald Trump actually got one electoral vote out of Maine. They have a different sort of system there than most states. Back in 1992, Ross Perot got close to 30% of the vote, I think, in Maine. So they have a very independent streak. Their other senator is an independent, and though he caucuses with the Democrats. So you could say there's one Democrat and maybe 1.5 Republicans who are kind of in opposition territory, many fewer than you saw in the last time around. There are a couple of other cases, a couple of other seats that I think are particularly vulnerable for Republicans. If you look at 270 to Win, which is one of the websites that tries to track some of these things, they perceive that there are, at this time, 4 toss-up seats, including Colorado and Maine. And so the long and short of it is that for Democrats to win a majority or to be able to control at least somewhat the operations of the Senate, they're going to have to win, if the election were held today, all 4 of the seats that are considered toss-ups, assume that they lose Alabama, and then win the presidency so that the vice president casts the tie-breaking vote. It would actually be a 50-50 Senate in that case. Because of this, the fact that the Democrats would, at this point at least, seemingly have to kind of run the table on these races, most analysts are saying there's at least a slight advantage to the Republicans. Probably the most likely scenario today is that the Republicans hang on by the skin of their teeth to a very small majority in the Senate. But the next most likely is the Democrats gain a majority by the skin of their teeth. So I think it's going to be very close, unless there's some wave that develops, which we'll find out more about next year.
Thank you, Andy. Sherry?
My turn. Okay, well, here, my job is to just put into context, this is the easy one, the impact of Donald Trump and his possible impeachment on the 2020 elections. What I'm going to do is just throw out a couple of basic political axioms that you can use when you begin to take a look and to weigh what's going on. First one, every election is a referendum on the incumbent. And one measure for that is the incumbent's approval rating. Trump's has never reached 50%. Currently, the Real Clear Politics average has it at about 42%. Not good, not good at all. But the election is still a year away, and there is that impeachment inquiry that's going on right now. Another one. Impeachments are unpredictable. Nobody bet the house on either side. Something can come up or something can be dropped that can move the vote on impeachment. If the impeachment occurs, and remember that, will one occur? I kind of think so. The House arithmetic dictates that. Impeachment only takes a majority vote, and the Democrats have more than the 218 votes necessary to impeach. But what about conviction? Would Trump survive if impeachment were held today, and it never is? He would survive. The Senate arithmetic, as Andy kind of intimated, does dictate that. Conviction requires a 2/3 vote, and there are 53 Republicans, and 67 votes are needed for conviction. That brings up another basic political axiom. Where you stand depends on where you sit. And both parties are so polarized that there's not much movement from one seat over the aisle to another. Another measurement of a president's vulnerability is, as I'm sure you all recognize, the state of the economy. And although sometimes the stock market looks like a runaway roller coaster, the general perception has been that the economy is perking along. And in politics, perception is reality. I think you see it working already out there among Donald Trump's base. But again, where are we going to be next year? We don't know that. Will Trump suffer if the economy tanks on his watch, or will a perking economy give him an edge? One more axiom: this election, like every other election, will come down to turnout. Dan will guide you down that road. For now, suffice it to note that all we've just glimpsed, and I hope we'll get into more in discussion, helps to create the context that will define Donald Trump's role in and impact on the 2020 elections, which is to say, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy year.
Thank you, Sherry. And I promise we will get back to impeachment and the president and all of the interesting topics. But in the meantime, Matt, what are you looking at in 2020?
So I was asked to talk a little bit about the House and the Senate. Andrew covered a little bit of the Senate, but I'll touch base on it briefly as well. Obviously, the Republicans hold a 3-seat majority, so the Democrats need to pick up the 3. Doug Jones is the most vulnerable Democrat in Alabama. Trump is plus 28 in Alabama, which is a pretty solid number for the president. It all depends on, though, if the Alabama Republican Party decides that Roy Moore didn't get a fair hearing last time. Stranger things have happened. That being said, the Democrats have some pretty good opportunities. Cory Gardner in Colorado, I believe Hickenlooper, the former governor, is going to run against him. In Arizona, Martha McSally was appointed to John McCain's seat when he passed away. And Gabrielle Giffords' husband, former astronaut, is running against him. That state is very, very purple right now, and that is too close to call. And then in North Carolina, Tom Tillis, he is also potentially pretty vulnerable. What could be interesting, though, is so the Democrats' timeline in the House for impeachment has been pushed. Originally, they wanted to get it done before Thanksgiving. They wanted to do a little bit of speed dating, hearings behind closed doors, run their vote before Thanksgiving, and kick it to the Senate to vote before the holidays. That's not likely to happen right now. If anything, the Democrat House impeachment would occur probably between Thanksgiving and Christmas, which means that you'd face a Senate trial after the first of the year, which heading into the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary for Senators Booker, Bennett, Klobuchar, and Harris is going to create some real problems for the Democratic primary, because it's not like you can say that Donald Trump is an existential threat to America and then go campaigning in southern Iowa while they're voting in the United States, or you are a juror in a trial in the United States Senate. Joe Biden probably loves it because it thins the herd for him to campaign, but it will create some huge problems in the Democratic primary. Looking at the House, there are 51 seats right now that are rated as toss-ups. The Democrats obviously hold the majority. They have 235 seats. The Republicans have 199. One of the reasons why speculation is that Nancy Pelosi has not done what was done in 1973 and in the late 80s for the Clinton impeachment, why they haven't held a House vote, is that there are 31 House Democrats that hold seats where Donald Trump won the majority. So she has not had that vote yet. They may do that, but bottom line, the seats that are the most likely to flip are in the Rust Belt and in the Sun Belt. Maybe we could get some of the 7 seats that the Democrats picked up in California to turn back. I would have said before this week that Katie Hill was in a pretty safe seat, but given the photographs that have come out and the pretty scandalous stuff, hopefully...
We got a president who runs a close second. We can talk about that later.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. But if you want to, you've now compared Katie Hill to Donald Trump. I don't think Katie Hill likes that comparison. So,
I'm not Katie Hill.
You mean you don't have a tattoo on your?
No, I don't. No. And I doubt she does either.
Okay. Well, all that being said, I'll leave it with the last perception in reality. Sherry talked about the economy. So 2 stats that I find really interesting. Incumbent president, economy not in recession since 1900, 12 wins, 0 losses. Non-party specific. Incumbent president, economy in recession since 1900, 1 win, 5 losses. So how the economy does is the largest single indicator as to whether Donald Trump gets reelected or not, irrespective of impeachment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan to talk about the turnout.
So let the record show that it took 12 and a half minutes of our panel discussion before Katie Hill's name was mentioned. I lost the pool on that one. I was much more optimistic than that. So Matt, thanks for ruining my pool outcome. I want to thank you for letting me join you here today. And especially want to thank Stuart and Elizabeth, not only for putting our discussion together, but the whole program. I love coming to this, as I know many of you do. And Stuart and his team at VICA do a tremendous job. And before I get started, I think we ought to take a minute to thank them for the work that they do. So thank you very much. Okay, that got me a dinner at Mastro's from Stuart for next week, so thank you all very much. If you clap a little bit more enthusiastically, I'll get another one, but I guess that's about as good as we're going to get, Stuart, so you're going to have to live with it, okay? Stuart and Elizabeth told me when they asked me to be on this panel, they said, Dan, what our members really want is very typical cable TV blather. They want to hear horse race. They want to hear the stuff that they can turn on CNN or Fox or MSNBC and hear every night, and they want to hear you repeat it. Would that be okay? And as you can tell, my fellow panelists, to their credit, ignored that advice. And I will too, because to me what's much more important than the candidates in any election are the voters. And all of you know, because all of you've read, you've heard, you've experienced, we hear a lot in the 21st century about the angry American voter. And what I'd suggest as a teacher and as a parent is what I've learned over the years is that underneath most angry people are frightened people. And so I think the one thing I'd encourage you to keep in mind as you watch this election unfold over the next 12 and a half months, yeah, we have a ways to go, over the next 12 and a half months, is that the overriding sentiment in this electorate is fear. And there are two really large groups of frightened voters. One, there is a group of frightened voters that believes, that is frightened, that their stake in the American dream is being taken away from them. And the president excels at encouraging and leveraging those fears to his political benefit. There's another group of people who are equally fearful that they are being denied their shot at the American dream at all. And Bernie Sanders and others are equally effective as Trump at leveraging those fears to their political benefit. So what does it mean when you're dealing with an electorate of frightened people? Well, when I came up in politics a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, we learned what was called the 80-20 theory of voter turnout, the 80-20 theory. And the 80-20 theory suggested, as you may have already cracked my code, that I as a campaign should spend 80% of my time, 80% of my money, 80% of my energy targeting the middle 20% of the electorate, because that's going to get me from the plurality that my party represents to a majority that will elect my candidates. And over the years, that the equation has changed. And as voters become more and more fearful, the idea of targeting and persuading undecided voters becomes less and less important to campaigns. Because frightened people, whether they're frightened children or frightened voters, they don't want to be persuaded with calm, reasoned logic. They need to be motivated. And far too often, unfortunately, they need someone to blame for their fears. And so what's happened over the last 20 years of American politics, we can talk more about this later if you like, as some of the other ramifications of it, is we've moved from an election system in which candidates spend most of their time trying to persuade undecided voters, moving them from midfield toward their respective ideological end zone, to rather motivating their most loyal supporters. And motivating a base to turn out on election day. One, it's a much more effective way of leveraging a frightened voter. But second, it's a lot easier. It's a lot less time consuming, it's a lot more energy efficient, it costs a lot less money. Because if I'm trying to persuade an undecided voter, I have to do two things. I have to convince that voter to vote, and I have to convince that voter to vote for me. If I'm trying to motivate someone who's already on my side, all I have to do is convince them to vote. One act instead of two, half the time, half the money, half the energy. So the way to look at this election, I appreciate Sherry giving me the setup on this, is which side will be more effective at motivating their most loyal supporters to turn out on election day. There are a small number of undecided voters in American politics. Roughly 5% of the electorate voted for Barack Obama in 2012 and for Donald Trump in 2016. And in a close election, you need some of those undecided voters. But the basic question is, which side will be more effective at motivating, at inspiring, at exciting, at inflaming their frightened base by reminding them why they have so much to be fearful of the alternative on the other side? Two basic questions, and I'll cover them quick, and then we can turn this into a conversation. The primary question for the Democrats, it seems to me, is one of ambition. Not ambition as opposed to as it relates to the candidates themselves, because every candidate for president is ambitious to a ridiculous degree. But how ambitious do the Democrats want to be ideologically? Simply put, do they want a revolution or a course correction? And for many voters, Democratic voters and many centrist voters, simply replacing the current president is enough. This is the Joe Biden message. Some of you may remember this great Netflix show from a few years ago called Bloodline. Did anyone ever see this? Linda Cardellini, Ben Mendelsohn, Kyle Chandler? You're nodding. So the motto for the show, it was about a big sprawling Florida family that committed this horrible crime. And the slogan for the show was, "We're not bad people. We just did a bad thing." That's essentially the Joe Biden for president campaign message. We're not bad people, we just did a bad thing. We made a mistake, let's fix it and let's go on. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and others are saying, no, that's not good enough. We need much more sweeping, much more dramatic change. The question for Democratic primary voters, once again, is can you motivate your base with a course correction? Or do you need to try to engineer a revolution, even if it may push away some of those somewhat undecided voters? The question for Republicans, and we can come back to it later, is one of loyalty. And that's a matter of personal loyalty, pure and simple. Absolutely. How loyal will Donald Trump's most fervent supporters stay to him over the next 12 and a half months? And I know we all have thoughts on that, so I'll wind it up and we'll come back to it in a few minutes.
Let's stay on that topic, actually, and I'll pose this question to Matt. But your premise saying, you know, basically there's two models: the old way, where you would try to convince a swing voter in Ohio or Indiana and go after the moderate, versus, you know, churning out your base and urban corridors, big cities. So let's hypothetically, you know, September, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders is the Democratic nominee. Are they really going to concede moderate voters in the Rust Belt? And
Who's they
Who
being
are they?
Bernie and
Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders is the nominee in September. Are they going to concede kind of the moderate vote and just go after an energy model where you're trying to churn out your base? Is that the strategy?
Well, I think that what Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, assuming the premise of your question holds, that they will try to frame their arguments that their policies would actually benefit those middle-of-the-road voters in Ohio or in Wisconsin or in Michigan, places that the Democrats need to capture to win the election. The challenge that they're going to face, though, is that Brad Parscale, Trump's campaign manager right now, is building, he's building the most aggressive micro-targeting behavioral sciences election database that has ever been built in the history of campaigns. 4 years from now, it will be passé. But right now, he will be able to go into a specific congressional district or a precinct in Ohio where they know that Elizabeth Warren talking about Medicare for all, and this district has a high number of senior citizens. He'll go in and micro-target all in that area and drive turnout on that one issue away from Warren towards Trump.
Maybe. We don't know that as a fact. And there are other factors involved.
But there may be other factors involved.
There are.
But there may be. But I'm telling you, the level of micro-targeting that the Donald Trump campaign will do will blow away everything that has been done previously. And he will not be underfunded like he was 4 years ago against Mrs. Clinton.
He wasn't underfunded, Matt. You have to understand that it looked like he had very little money, but there was a study that indicates that in terms of earned media, free media, he was given about $2 billion in free media, which never gets counted as part of campaign expenditures. So don't say he was underfunded.
If I could just add something to this, I think if Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren is the Democratic nominee, they can't totally ignore those states because the Electoral College still exists, right? So they can plump up their margins in California.
Hillary
did. Well, she did.
Yeah.
I'm saying they can't and win, right? I mean, they can't ignore them and hope to have a different outcome than in 2016. I mean, obviously they could ignore them if they chose to, but it wouldn't probably be very wise. I agree with Sherry that the way they're going to try to focus on those states is not by making any kind of concessions, really, not by moderating themselves in any significant way, but rather by trying to frame their position in a way that will peel off just enough, and they don't need much, right? In Michigan, they need a few thousand votes, a few thousand in Wisconsin, not much more than that in Pennsylvania, and that's how I think they'll go about it. But I don't think they're going to frame I don't think they're going to, you could say, moderate their message to try to appeal to those people.
Well, yeah, Elizabeth Warren already has begun to do that, and it's one of the reasons she's so nervous about the question of who's going to pay for Medicare for all. But remember, Bernie Sanders has said, I am a socialist, and Elizabeth Warren said, I am a capitalist to my bones. So she's, you know, I think that Bernie Sanders will be more rigid in maintaining his perspective, and Elizabeth Warren, it's just a gut, but I think she would be more easily, more amenable toward moving toward the center, toward talking at least to the center.
Pat, if I can add on to Sherry's point, because I think it's a smart one. Yeah, I lumped Warren and Sanders together, and there's no question they are by far the two most progressive candidates in the upper tiers of the Democratic primary, but they are different in the regard that Sherry just articulated. Bernie Sanders and his team believe, as does Donald Trump, ironically enough, that you don't need swing voters.
That's right.
You don't need undecided voters. If you can motivate your base to a certain degree, you will win. And they talk about how African American and Latino turnout among young voters dropped precipitously between 2012 and 2016. If they can turn out those voters again, he believes he'll win. If Warren believed that, she would have stood on the debate stage last week and said, yes, I'm going to raise taxes on middle-class Americans the same way Bernie Sanders is. And the fact that her campaign is going to such lengths, in such public lengths, to show how careful she's deliberating about how she's going to pay for universal health care is essentially acknowledging, I can't win with just the base. I might be able to motivate them a lot more than Biden or Harris or Buttigieg, but I need somebody from the middle too. Otherwise, she would have leapt on the Sanders ideological bandwagon. The fact that, as Sherry points out, she's being more careful means that she's probably been a little bit more thoughtful about what it takes to win a general election than Sanders has been.
That's important. I think I want to switch topics here, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for some Q&A from the audience. But before we do that, I want to cover impeachment. Right? This is what everyone's watching. You turn the TV on, it's impeachment, impeachment, impeachment. It's all we hear about. So I kind of want to discuss, and everyone can chime in on their thoughts. But I want to talk about the political risks of Democrats. It seems after the Mueller report was released, there was a steady clamoring of calls for an impeachment query among the Democratic caucus. Speaker Pelosi was extremely reluctant to go down that path. Then you have this whistleblower complaint, you have the transcript come out from the Ukraine call, and all of a sudden Pelosi says, all right, we're going to do an impeachment inquiry. So I'll start with Sherry. Sherry, what is the political risk to Democrats going down this road, and why don't they just take a vote to officially, approve or formalize the impeachment inquiry?
Do you know how much it breaks my heart to hear that question, to give primary concern to political risk? And that's one of the problems with what's going on right now. I wish they would all, they aren't going to do it, but this goes far beyond political risk. Regardless of how impeachment turns out, there has to be a discussion, a discovery of what this may well be doing to democracy. I mean, these guys and gals were elected to be the voice of the people, the caretakers of our democratic rules, our democratic, with a small d, our democratic norms, our U.S. Constitution. Nobody really is even giving a lot of thought to that equation. The equation is, what is the political risk to me? And that ought not to be the case. And I don't really care what the political risk is for any one of them, Democrats or Republicans. I am sick and tired of the shenanigans that I see going on in Washington and the lack of concern with which we're going as a country. So I'm not going to answer your question.
Well, and
I appreciate that.
And Pat, just to be clear, what everybody is watching, they're not watching the actual testimony. They're watching the spin from the Democrats and from the Republicans interpreting what they say they think they heard. I mean, because most of the Republicans and most of the Democrats aren't in the SCIF where Schiff is holding these trials. So, or these, the trials.
Matt,
They're not, the majority of both parties are not in the room right now for this.
And they weren't for Clinton.
But hold
and
on,
they didn't,
can
as the Nixon administration.
Could I please finish
began.
my thought?
No, it's irrelevant. Go
No,
ahead.
but, no, my point is that they're speculating, they're not in the room, they don't know what's going on. They're being told by people who are in the room, or they're just making stuff up. So, right now, this is, when the downside of a 24-hour news cycle is they need to fill 24 hours worth of news. That was my context, Sharon.
What does that mean?
It means that they're filling it up with a lot of either erroneous or bogus or speculative information on both sides.
So Dan, do voters care about impeachment? Is this something they're focused on, or is it the economy and healthcare? What do they care about?
Well, in 2018, Nancy Pelosi did an excellent job with her candidates, reminding them that talking about impeachment or even focusing on attacks on Trump were not a ticket to victory. They learned in 2016 from the Clinton campaign that if all you do is criticize Trump's behavior, you're fighting on his turf. And to Pelosi's credit, she convinced her candidates to talk about health care, to talk about jobs, to talk about substantive issues. So their biggest challenge in the impeachment is how quickly it can be done. In other words, they don't want to be they want to be talking about health care and jobs next spring and summer, not about impeachment of the president. And it's a very, very fine line for the Democrats to walk, to go quickly enough through this process so it doesn't interfere with their more substantive message on the issues that affect the daily lives of voters, without looking like they're rushing through it, because this is clearly not the kind of thing you rush through. Two very quick things on impeachment. One, going back to the motivation point that I mentioned earlier, Donald Trump needs to motivate his base. He does not have a wall. The Affordable Care Act is still in place. There are still U.S. troops in Afghanistan. One of the single most effective ways for him to motivate his base is by talking about impeachment. And the question, coming back to the point I was making earlier, is how much of his base will remain loyal to him even through impeachment. There's polling out now that shows among evangelical Christians close to 30% now support impeachment hearings. That's an extraordinary figure. It's not determinative for something months from now, but worth keeping in mind. The other point I'd make is this. As has been mentioned earlier, it will require 20 Republican senators to vote to remove a president of their own party from office in order for Trump to be removed. He will almost certainly be impeached by the House of Representatives. The question is, are there 20 votes, Republican votes, to remove him? I'll offer you this. There are 7 Republicans up for re-election next year in competitive seats. That means either in a seat in which a Democrat has won a statewide election in the last 3 election cycles, or in which the margins have been within mid-single digits. There are 7 Republicans running for re-election next year in states that are potentially competitive. In 2022, there are 6 Republicans running in competitive states. There are 5 Republican senators who have announced that they are retiring from the Senate. And like Jeff Flake, like Bob Corker, no longer have to worry about the political consequences. If you add Mitt Romney to that, for those of you stuck with the math, that is 19 Republican senators. So if every single Republican senator is facing a competitive race next year, if every single Republican is facing a competitive race in 2022, if every single retiring senator and Romney vote to remove Trump from office, that's 1 short. That's not saying that it can't happen. It's not saying that it will. But if you want to track going forward as the House continues to investigate what the likelihood is, that's the pathway.
Andy, I want to get you in here before we open it up to Q&A. You're an historian of presidential elections. James Carville has a saying in the 90s, it's the economy's stupid. All signs point to the economy's good. Does that not guarantee, but is that going to position Donald Trump for a win next year?
Well, it puts him in I guess I'd put it this way. If the economy were not doing well, I think there would be no question that he would lose, right? It puts him in the game if the economy is doing well. I think that, there were very powerful numbers given. The presidents who were running for re-election when there was no recession, 12 out of 12 won. I'm not sure I would take that to the bank this time. Only because we haven't had a president, at least since polling has begun, serious polling, who has never been above 50%, right? As Sherry pointed out, he's in a situation where I think if you look at the real Clear Politics average, he was actually barely above 50% on Inauguration Day. And by the end of the
I don't
first,
think so.
He's
because-
never been-
no,
he's
he's
never
never
been
been
above
above
50%.
50%.
okay, well he was closer than he is now, but he went downhill within 3 days. He was underwater within a couple of weeks, and so he's in a very different situation than most presidents. And it has been pointed out, people like Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, all were kind of in that mid 40% range 1 year before the election, more or less where Donald Trump is now. But the difference is they had all been at 60, 70, at some point, they had a significant majority of people who liked them, and they had to bring them back, and a lot of that was due to the economy in all of those cases, most of it probably, but they still had those people out there who had A, voted for them, and B, approved of them at some point, who they could pull back. And Donald Trump doesn't have that. So I think he's in a tougher spot than those presidents, and kind of a unique spot.
Okay.
Real quick, the
ahead.
challenge, though, is Donald Trump versus an amorphous Democratic candidate, Donald Trump loses. Donald Trump versus another specific person, meaning that it is a binary choice, and it changes the dynamics of that question entirely, because now you have someone with, Donald Trump has so much baggage, he's got to match, his luggage all matches. But whomever he runs against is going to have baggage as well. And when you then square them up person to person, that's when the dynamics of the race change. What was that? New York Times, the day of Election Day, gave Hillary Clinton an 83% chance of winning.
Right.
It was Nate Silver,
Okay, there you go.
435.
So, there you go. There's a litany of problems now with public opinion research. Again, when Donald Trump gets a specific person to run against, that's when we can have a more educated conversation. But yeah, his numbers suck. They've always sucked. But that's not what gets Donald Trump elected.
I know we have some questions here. I think I saw your hand up first, and we'll go back there. Yes, sir.
So, given the fact that Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes, given the fact that Donald Trump won with 70,000 votes distributed between 3 states, taking into account what Matt said about the micro-targeting that the Republican campaign is going to do, how afraid should we be that, because it would seem that if you get 3 million more votes, 70,000 more votes is just a drop in the bucket. But it is where the specific votes are. How afraid should we be of the power of that micro-targeting in this upcoming election?
I'll go back to the formulation I offered earlier about frightened voters. It's not a lot of voters in 3 Rust Belt states, but they are particularly fearful voters because they are white, working class, older voters at or near retirement age who are experiencing a transition, as we all are, from a manufacturing-based economy to a technology-based economy. And for all the people in our society who are concerned about that transition and what's ahead, the most frightened of it are older voters who have lived most of their lives based on skills that they developed in a manufacturing-based economy. And when Trump talks about trade, when Trump talks about immigration, he is micro-targeting them very, very specifically to say, you have every right to be frightened, and I'm the only one who's going to protect you.
Here, you want to hear something really, truly scary from the turnout perspective? I think that the Democratic candidate in 2020, regardless of who that person is, they don't win by 3 point whatever million votes that Mrs. Clinton won by. They win by 5 million votes. Because the population growth in the states that are dark blue has actually grown significantly faster than the states with all the electoral votes that Trump's going to clean up on. And I think that Trump wins the Electoral College by a lesser margin. He won't get over 300 this time, but he can lose a couple of those states, Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin, very easily, and still squeak out, what is it, the 271 that he needs. So talk about, you will now have, this will be the third election since the 2000s where the individual getting the largest share of the popular vote is not seated in the Oval Office.
Wow. Who else? I think we had one in the back in the red tie.
So I wanted to go back to something Matt said. Good point. And that is about that public opinion surveying is we're seeing pretty suspect these days. And I'm glad Dan is here since he knows a little bit about polling. One of the big things from 2016, and every time that you bring up a poll that shows that Trump is doing poorly, all the Republican apologists always says, well, you can't believe the polling. So the question is, can you believe the polling? Where are we today when these polls come out and they show Trump, at 40% approval, and they show Biden beating Trump by 10 points in every state across the country? I mean, what, as consumers of political information, what should we be looking at when we see polling results reported in the media?
The gentleman's reference, for those of you who aren't aware, is that I was the founder of the USC LA Times statewide political survey. Though I'm no longer involved in it, in 2016, our poll, as some of you may know, predicted that Donald Trump would be elected president. Now, I got all sorts of congratulations and all sorts of hatred as a result of that, but the first thing that I'll make 2 points. One, as I said, daily for almost an entire year, we're a thermometer, not a thermostat. But second, we were wrong, of course, because Trump did not win the Electoral College. That said, there was something.
No, he did not win the popular
Excuse me,
vote.
Trump didn't. Thank you, Sherry.
And I think
Sherry, let me just finish,
yeah,
okay?
but
Thank you. No, but
don't forget to make the point that this is a
I
national
won't forget.
poll.
Will you let me finish?
Calm
Thank you.
down,
All right.
Dan.
All right.
I'm
So
only trying to be helpful,
we'll keep trying.
but I'm a girl.
So the poll was not correct because it predicted Trump would win, and of course Trump did not win the popular vote. That said, there was something valuable in it that I think goes right to your question. The poll and the methodology we used for the first time in this that was developed by a group of really smart people at an institute at USC called the Center for Economic and Social Research, CESAR, which is my favorite acronym in all of higher education. The people at CESAR came up with a poll methodology that instead of measuring voter preference, measured voter intensity. And this gets back to the point I made earlier about base motivation. Most polls ask you, do you prefer candidate A or candidate B? Are you going to vote for Sherry or are you going to vote for Matt? What these smart people at CESAR did instead is they came up with 2 questions. They said, on a scale of 0 to 100, how certain are you of your vote for your preferred candidate? And on a scale of 0 to 100, how certain are you that you are going to vote on election day? And the raw numbers, as the results showed, came back for Clinton. More people said they were supporting Clinton in this survey than said they were supporting Trump. But on those 2 measures, the Clinton responses were in the high 50s, low to mid 60s. The Trump measurements were in the low to mid 90s. So even though he is a smaller base of support, in 2016 they were much more fervent and much more loyal base of support. All of you who work in business know the difference between a targeted consumer base and trying to appeal to the entire consumer base. Every business that Trump has ever worked in over the course of his professional life was a niche consumer business. In real estate, you don't need to reach everybody. In casinos, you don't need to reach everyone. So his entire professional and political upbringing is targeting a small number of people and making them loyal to him. And what the SC Times polls showed is in that very specific respect, he succeeded. He didn't broaden his appeal. Why? Because as Pat correctly pointed out, he never bothered to try. But his plurality of the electorate was much more impassioned and much more motivated to him. And that as I was saying earlier, I think drives the outcome of 2020 as well.
Let me add something. It's just, all of you just remember that in reality, any poll is just basically a snapshot in time. So you can't really put your finger on simply any poll. Remember that. Things change. Also, if you want to get a sense of the trend, take a look at the average of polls over time. Real Clear Politics does that. And polling right now, if you are polling nationally, doesn't give you a really good test of who is going to win, because nationally it polls only the popular vote.
So what campaigns are using, though? They may use some survey research, public opinion polls, but they're using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And they are polling, or they are out using they can ask normal English language questions every single day, and you can track, instead of 1,200 high propensity voters, machine learning, they read 48,000 pages an hour or some ridiculous number like that. So they're not tracking what people say, they're tracking behavior online. So you want to know what the Trump campaign is doing, and I assume the Democrats are doing it as well. This is the data that they're using, and you can say, like, I know, for example, that CNN used this type of behavioral research to determine if attacking Donald Trump was costing them viewers. The answer obviously is no, because they continue to do it. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what the campaigns are doing, to read voter, and they can get subtle changes in behavior that then they can go in and micro-target literally down to the block level, because every person that goes to those Trump rallies, they're pulling in all that data. All the people outside, they're pulling in all that data. And that just gets fed back into their voter model to make a more robust targeting model. And that's why what Brad Parscale's doing, the people who hate it are calling it the Death Star, because it's going to be very effective. Obama did it in 2008, and he was a visionary for using social media and iPads to go block to block. Usually the parties hit the ball back and forth over the tennis, over the net. The Republicans appear at this time to have an advantage, and also Trump has an empty playing field. So he's just building the machine right now, whereas the Democrats are fighting amongst themselves, and they will continue to do that probably up through the convention.
Great, thank you. Over here.
In 2018, we watched Republicans drop off of focus in certain regions. Should Donald Trump be running against a Warren or a Sanders type, how do you see Republican vote either dropping off continuously in those districts or not at all? And how do you see that impacting the targeted Senate races?
I don't know that the Democratic opponent will have a tremendous effect on motivating Trump's base. They're motivated because of him. In 2016, a lot of them turned out for him because they didn't like Hillary Clinton, but now they're motivated for him. So if the level of Republican motivation stays fairly consistent regardless of the nominee, the question, Lisa, and I know this is where you're going, is, how does that impact the other side? Republicans are motivated at the same level in both degrees by nominating a more progressive candidate. The Democrats establish perhaps more of a motivational edge. The trade-off is it costs them votes in the center. But I don't, and I'd be interested in the other panelists, I don't know that a more progressive Democrat increases Republican-based motivation.
I don't know either. I don't think so. I think the point, Lisa, is that one point that you need to consider is the reality that perhaps the Republican turnout has decreased because Republican registration has been decreasing, and that's particularly a good example of that is what has happened in California, where the Republican Party is now the third party in this state, behind no party preference, and the Democratic registration is decreasing a little too, but not nearly as dramatically as the Republican registration. So the core is shrinking, and that, I think, is part of what's reflected in the decrease, what looks to be a decrease in motivation.
Yeah, but nationally, I mean, look, we're modeling we're modeling close to 90% turnout for November in California. That's astronomical turnout.
I can't believe
So,
that.
but presidential numbers, and this is going to be one of those really, really special elections, because they're both sides. I mean, what's Trump Republican base support? 92% right now?
In between 80 to 90 plus.
Well, he's in the low 90s. I know that pretty consistently among Republicans.
No,
so-
no, he dropped a bit.
Okay.
I'll just throw out one small fact that I think is interesting from 2018. There was a lot of emphasis on the loss of Republican seats in suburban districts, and that was really the focus of a lot of the analysis. If you look at the actual exit polls from 2018, they had a smaller drop-off in vote in the suburban population than in the rural population. Yeah, I think it was, I can't remember exactly, but it was maybe 4% decline in their suburban vote and something like 7% in their rural vote. But they lost seats in the suburban districts because they were closer to begin with, right? And it made more difference. But you see that in a number of dimensions where it was what you might consider kind of base voters for Republicans who fell off a little bit more than some of the people who were most focused on.
Do you have a question?
So clearly, Trump doesn't stand a chance in California. However, you just mentioned really high turnout numbers that you're projecting for November 2020 for California voters. What does that mean for what's going to be going on within our state? We're going to have a lot of initiatives on the ballot. There's going to be local sales tax measures being considered. What should we be looking at, I guess, when you're looking at some of those more local issues or even statewide measures that could be, playing off of what's going on at the national level? Can you just
Sure.
start with that?
Yeah, I think lots of revenue measures in November for sure. Especially, I mean, we all know that there's one split roll measure that is already qualified. There's a second one that's circulating. The California School Board Association is circulating a $15 billion wealth tax that will be on, that could be on in addition to split roll. We're hearing more rumors about more local ballot measures in LA County, which is what, 70% Democrat by registration. So I think you're going to get a lot of revenue measures on because people think that this is the time to do it. Additionally, for the 7 seats, it just depends if more Republican, I mean, like Harley Rauda's seat in Orange County, for example. Donald Trump is actually above 50% in that district from a support standpoint. So I think that he has to look, very closely at what that looks like. Katie Porter is raising a ton of money, but she is going to be vulnerable in Orange County. So I mean, I think the state is by no means anything but the deepest of dark blue, and it will continue to be that way. But there will be hundreds of billions of dollars, or billions and billions of dollars of money, tax money on the ballot. And I think the Democrats, they'll keep their supermajorities in both.
Just quickly to follow up on that, since the constituency in the room is primarily business owners.
Yeah.
Are the voters ready to vote for more tax increases? Just because the Democrats higher turnout, obviously, and they're more prone to, raising revenue. But does the California voter want to vote for more taxes? Dan or Shelley?
If turnout were evenly distributed across the ideological spectrum, I think passing either a split roll or a significant income tax increase would be very difficult. In a pre-Trump political landscape, ballot initiatives tend to drive voter turnout much more than candidates do. Candidates are means to an end, but taxes, schools, healthcare, whatever the issue happens to be, that hits voters at a much more visceral level. And with the tax initiatives on the ballot, with the privacy initiative, with the gig workers initiative potentially on the ballot, to build on the point that Matt was making a minute ago, the Democrats clearly have determined that although initiatives usually drive turnout more than candidates, that Trump is such a vote motivator, and in California, not so much for his supporters, but for his opponents, that loading up the ballot with initiatives that presume a much larger Democratic turnout than ever, gives these type of initiatives a much greater chance of success than usual. My own personal opinion is that the split roll is still an uphill fight. And Matt can talk very authoritatively after this program's over to anyone who'd like to hear it about how local election results here sort of predetermine that. But once again, if turnout is much heavier among Trump opponents than Trump supporters, then that increases the chances the chances of an anti-business initiative succeeding.
I would just add, I think, if there is 90% voter turnout, which would be astounding, my guess is that that's going to help Democrats in partisan races for the most part. I think it would have an unpredictable result on tax matters because the additional, if you understand kind of the general way that these things work, the voters who are the last ones in are generally sort of at the lower end of the economic scale and maybe lower levels of education. Or to put it another way, when people don't vote, they're disproportionately people at that end, right? So if 90% are voting, you're going to get a lot more of those voters than you usually get. They might be all for a wealth tax, but they're not going to be so sure about sales tax or other taxes that hit them harder.
Do you have another?
Okay, so I guess the question that I have is there's 19 senators who could possibly vote for impeachment. And if he is impeached and it goes before the Senate, we see a trial, and it's now public. And the public says, well, that's kind of an abuse of power, or what he did was inappropriate, being a democracy. And he was against that democracy in his behavior. Is there a Barry Goldwater? Is there a John McCain?
Dan just talked about 19.
Who would stand up and say, you know what, country before politics?
So this is going to infuriate a sizable portion of the people in the room, but I'll answer it anyway. The question is a really, really smart one because it refers to this seminal moment in Watergate when Barry Goldwater and Congressman John Rhodes went to Nixon and said, you have to resign for the good of the party and the good of the country. Two big differentiators here. Richard Nixon had been a Republican for almost half a century before that meeting took place. Donald Trump today is only a Republican in the most technical of terms. I would say neither is a compliment or an insult. He's less a Republican than a takeover artist who saw an opportunity with the party whose ideological grounding had begun to wither. So number one, the argument is a tougher one for someone who doesn't hold that same kind of partisan loyalty the way Nixon did. That said, I'll tell you who I think that person is, should it happen, is one of two people. And ironically, they're the two Republican senators who co-sponsored a resolution yesterday to condemn the House impeachment proceedings, Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell. Now, Lindsey Graham has come under a tremendous amount of criticism over the last few years because of the way his relationship with the president has changed. The most charitable way of viewing that, and that's not necessarily my opinion, but the most charitable way of viewing that is that Graham, believes that he maintains some leverage with Trump by being so obsequious to him whenever he doesn't need that leverage. That may or may not be the case, but ironically enough, Lindsey Graham could be the 20th vote. Or the other person I'd suggest would be the possibility is Mitch McConnell. Now hear me out on this one a second. Mitch McConnell is not a Trump Republican. He is about as much Republican establishment as all the Bushes in a row. And he spends a great deal of time thinking about what the Republican Party will be like after Donald Trump. And if he believed that the process of rebuilding the party in a post-Trump era could be accelerated, he's the least risky person in politics. But if he truly believed that there were 19 votes in his pocket, he's also, along with Pelosi, the best vote counter in politics. If he believed that he had 19 removal votes in his pocket, then he could be the person to go to the president or organize people who the president respects from the private sector to go to the president and say this is time. So I mentioned 19 people earlier. If you want to know who 20 is, it's either Lindsey Graham or Mitch McConnell. Think about that for a minute. Does Pence get a vote in impeachment?
If it's a tie.
It doesn't matter. If it's
No.
a tie,
Yeah.
you don't have your 2/3 vote. No,
He could not.
only if it's a 50-50 separation.
Yeah, and if it's a 50-50 tie, Sherry's exactly right, then being a 51st vote is sort of irrelevant.
Meaningless.
Yeah.
I know we're going to have to wrap up in just 1 minute, Pat, but if I can just offer one other piece of, calling it guidance is presumption, but how about a viewer's tip? If you want to get an early sense on these motivation questions we've been talking about earlier, I would recommend to you that unless the Washington Nationals win the next 2 games of the World Series, I would encourage you very strongly to watch the time leading up to the beginning of Game 5 of the World Series on Sunday night in Washington, D.C. Because last night the president announced that he intended to attend Game 5 of the World Series. This morning, the Washington Nationals invited a man by the name of Jose Andres, noted civic leader and very virulent Trump critic, to throw out the first pitch
And a wonderful restaurant.
at the World Series on Sunday night. And so the dynamic of Trump attending that game and Andres throwing out the first pitch, that could give us an early indication on which side is more motivated and at a higher fever pitch going into 2020.
And I just want to add one quick thing, because, you know, Dan really did lay it out very well. But the thing that worries me about the lack of a Goldwater and the lack of a McCain is this. Richard Nixon, in the end, no matter what you thought about him, understood the democratic institutions, respected the democratic institutions. And the delegation went to him and said, this is dangerous for our country. This is dangerous for our democracy. You have to leave. And he understood that and respected that. Donald Trump doesn't even know what those institutions are. It's all transactional. It's all what's in it for me. Will it hurt me or will it help me? And when you're talking about rules and norms and traditions and institutions to somebody who doesn't even know what you're talking about, it's going to be a lot harder to get him to move away.
And Kobe, you will appreciate this. The Nats hope that there is no game on Sunday. They want to wrap it up on Saturday.
Can they?
Yeah, they can. If they win 2 more, they wrap it up.
I'm also not sure that Donald Trump's temperament would allow him to walk away.
That's my point.
I think, well, not just his,
Pat, or excuse me, Andrew.
not voluntarily.
Andy, if I can offer, you may be right, and obviously neither of us know, which is why these makes these things fun. But I'll offer you a counter possibility on that. If Trump believes that he is going to lose re-election,
Right.
and wants to maintain that core, most dedicated support for his post-presidency, then either allowing the impeachment to move forward, or the removal to move forward, or resigning himself will put him in the role that he enjoys most, the role of victim, and allow him to continue to motivate and inspire his most fervent supporters for the rest of his career. That's much more exciting and motivational than simply losing a re-election campaign.
I'm under very strict orders to keep us on time, so unfortunately we don't have any more time for questions, and I apologize, but I'm sure our panelists would be more than happy to stick around afterwards to answer questions. Before we pack up, I have to pin these panelists on at least one prediction today, okay? Just please, it's a one-word answer. In your opinion, which Democratic candidate is going to win the primary in California in March? Which Democratic candidate? And I'll start with Andy, and just please, one word or one name.
One man?
I guess I'll say Warren.
Warren, okay.
None of the above.
Okay.
Biden.
Biden?
Say, whoever wins the South Carolina primary will win the California primary.
Okay. All right, that's fine. I'll let you get away with that one. Thank you, everyone, and again, appreciate the sponsors. Thank you.
That was fun.
That's good.
I just